Much anticipated blitz match between notorious American Grandmaster Hans Niemann and Russian Grandmaster Daniil Dubov was held in Moscow. Dubov, 28 years old, rated 2795, sixth best blitz player in the world. Niemann, 21 years old, rated 2734, 16th best blitz player in the world. A little history. During the World Championship held last year in New York, Dubov did not show up for the game against Niemann, and although the official version was Dubov overslept, it was pretty clear it was a protest, as many chess players, including Dubov, consider Hans Niemann a cheater. What's at stake for this game, for this match? 18 games, standard blitz time control, 3 minutes each with 2 seconds added for each move, $2,000 per game. More importantly, the loser of the match will be subject to a lie detector test. 9 games were played on day 1, and you can see my video on day 1 in the link below, and 9 games were played on day 2. And I want to start with the game number 13. Niemann is playing white. He starts with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6. We have 2 knights defense on the board, and this is one of the favorite openings in Niemann repertoire. d3, bishop e7, short castle, rook goes to e1, Dubov plays d6 to open up the diagonal for the light square bishop, a4, that's important to know in this opening. Most of the game is happening on the king side of the board, but it's also important to play on both sides of the board, and Niemann does exactly that with a4. Bishop e6, Niemann goes to d2 to take the bishop on c4 with the knight, in case Dubov captures it, and that's exactly what happened. Bishop c4, knight c4, h6, always a good prophylactical move. Bishop develops to d2, rook to e8, and the first aggressive move of the game from Niemann, b4, starting marching the pawns on the queen side of the board. Bishop retreats to f8 for Dubov, and the reason he does that move, he would like to protect the pawn on e5 with additional piece, with the rook, so potentially he can break in the middle with the pawn move d5 to make sure that the pawn on e5 is protected. Knight e3 would like to hop to either d5 or f5 squares, and immediate d5 from Dubov. He is looking to break in the center to challenge white pawns. b5 hitting the knight, knight goes to the middle of the board, knight d4, Niemann takes the pawn on d5, exchange of the knights on f3, queen takes f3, and the move e4 from Dubov. Now, if you take the pawn on e4, the knight will jump into a very nice square on e4, protected by the rook. The knight would be very active here, and although black is without a pawn, they will have a good initiative. Therefore, Niemann retreats with the queen on e2, bishop develops to a nice square on c5, rook d1, bishop takes e3, and Niemann takes with the pawn. So he can open up f-file for the rook. Exchange the pawns on d3 square, knight takes d5, and what do we have here? We have a pretty even position with even material, bishop against the knight, but knight is active, and white pawns on d3 and e3 are connected, and they could be either a strength or a weakness, depending on what will happen next. And Niemann immediately plays e4, starting to attack the black knight. Although at this point it's not under attack, as the pawn is pinned to the queen. Still, knight goes to e7, and bishop goes to c3, and Niemann has an absolutely beautiful bishop, dark square bishop now on a very nice diagonal, and it will play a big role later in the game. Knight g6, rook f1, getting into the open f file for Niemann, queen d7, rook f3, preparing to double up the rooks on f file, king goes to h7, and move e5, gaining space in the center of the board, but allowing black to get the queen into a nice square on d5. Move d4 supports the pawn on e5, f6, challenging white center using the pin. You cannot take the pawn now with the pawn because the queen would be lost. Therefore, queen goes away to c2 and creating a pin on the knight, which is very unpleasant actually for black. They take the pawn on e5, white do the same, attacking the queen. The queen goes back to e6 and queen e4. The queen is activated and potentially can take the pawn on b5. Rook goes to d8, and now Niemann does not want to take the pawn on b7, because if he takes the queen b7, then, first of all, the rook is under attack, so hold on a second. What I mean is he can exchange the rooks, and then he can take the pawn on b7. But in that case, black would have a very strong attack, starting with the move rook d1 check. And after, let's say, king f2, queen a2, and black attack is gonna be devastating for white. Therefore, still too early to capture the pawn on b7. First, rook goes to f1, doubling up the rooks and penetrating, would like to infiltrate into black position on a square f7. King goes to h8, which makes total sense. Dubov wants to free up the knight, which was pinned. h3, always a good prophylactic move, not to get any checkmates on the first rank. Knight goes back to f8. Dubov would like to shuffle some pieces. He would like to free up the queen from the square e6 and put the knight there instead to block the passing pawn e. a5. Knight goes to h7, and now the threat is knight g5, forking the queen and the rook. Queen takes b7, queen d5, offering exchange of the queens. Niemann declines the offer, takes the pawn on a7. Dubov goes knight g5, attacking the rook. The rook goes back to e3, and knight e6. So Dubov did what he wanted to do. He put the knight in front of the pawn, and now his queen is free to do some other things on the board. Rook f3, again doubling up the rooks. Queen takes b5, and queen f2, tripling the forces on the f file for Niemann. Queen c4, queen g3, queen e4, attacking the queen. Queen goes away to c4, and queen g6. Light squares around the black king are very weak. Unfortunately for Niemann, though, he doesn't have a light square bishop to help the queen to checkmate black on a square h7. And after the move queen c5, that pins the rook to the king, black actually equalized here. This position is already even, although a couple of moves ago white had a solid advantage. Rook e1, protecting the rook on e3, and the knight activates on a square f4, and here Dubov actually unleashes some very interesting tactics. After queen moves back to e4, he plays knight d3, using the fact that the rook is pinned and cannot take the knight, and after rook d1, he moves the knight to f2, forking the queen and the rook. And now what happens? The white are not on time to check, to take the rook on d8, because after knight takes e4, they take the rook with the check, but unfortunately for them, the rook is pinned and cannot take the knight on e4. and black simply wins with an extra queen. So after knight f2, the only move is king takes f2 and rook takes d1. So Dubov won in exchange in this variation, but the position is still very unclear because white has a very strong passing pawn e, and he immediately, Niemann immediately moves it to e6. Queen g5 and e7. After knight d7, it looks like black will just simply capture that important pawn because they have 3 attackers on that pawn. Niemann plays h4, attacking the queen. And in this position, the best move for black, or at least one of the best moves, was just to take the pawn with the rook, actually. And after white takes the queen, Dubov would take the queen on e4, and this position is slightly better for black. They have an extra exchange, although after this variation, this pawn is pinned. White has at least 2 pawns for the rook, for the exchange, and very, very good chances to draw this game. Instead, Dubov took the pawn with the queen and allowed Niemann to play a beautiful move, bishop takes g7 check, sacrificing the bishop. Now you cannot really take the bishop with the queen, because then queen takes g7, then you're gonna lose the rook on e8. And more importantly, let's not forget this is a blitz game. Both players are under tremendous time pressure. With seconds on the clock, it's very difficult to calculate everything. And therefore, instead of just taking the bishop with the king, which would have been okay for black, because let's say king takes g7, queen g4 check, king moves away to h7, rook takes the queen, and rook takes rook. We have 2 rooks for the queen, and this position is a little better for white because they have an extra passing pawn a5. But black has very good chances to draw this game. Instead, without calculating all the variations, without not having time to calculate all the variations, Dubov goes king g8 and runs into bishop e5 with all sorts of threats to the black king, which is who is very, very unsafe, not surrounded by the pawns. And Dubov plays queen f7 check, and now his position is totally lost after king g1, rook d1 check, king h2. It turns out that white have too many threats and black have no defense. Dubov played rook d6 using the pin. You cannot take the rook now because black would take the queen. But rook g3 check, king f8, and now you can take the rook with the bishop because it comes with the check. So bishop takes d6 check, pawn takes d6, and a very patient move, queen d4. And now it turns out that there is no real defense from the move rook f3, pinning and winning the black queen. Dubov played king e7 to move away from this file, but there is another opportunity to win the queen, pinning it from the square g7. So rook g7, Dubov resigned as he loses the queen and the game. Game number 16. White starts with d4. Dubov is playing white, Niemann is playing black, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5. We have Queen's Gambit declined. And after g3, we're transferring to Catalan defense, Catalan opening, with the bishop going to g2. I have to say that this is probably the best weapon in Dubov's repertoire, and he decides to finally use it only in game number 16. Bishop b4 check, knight d2, castle. Bishop goes to g2, b6, castle, bishop to b7 to counterattack the light square bishop for white, and knight goes to a central square e5. a5 for Nieman. Dubov plays a3, attacking the bishop. The bishop retreats to e7. b3 to develop the dark square bishop on b2. c5 immediately challenging white center. d takes c5, and bishop activates on the square c5, taking the pawn. Bishop goes to b2 for Dubov, and that bishop is becoming an absolute monster on this diagonal. Queen e7 for Nieman, c takes d5, and in this position, Nieman could take the pawn with the bishop, with the knight, or the pawn. All three options are okay for black, but he decides to play with an isolated pawn on a square d5, which is also not a big problem for black in this type of structures. Knight comes back to d3, hitting the bishop on c5, knight d7, knight f3, some shuffling of the knights going on for Dubov, rook e8, attacking the pawn on e2, Dubov defends it with e3, Nieman activates his light square bishop on the square a6 and pinning the knight to the rook. Rook moves away to e1. Nieman's rook comes to c8, occupying the open c file. Knight d4, g6, knight f4, and Nieman activates his knight on a square e5. b4, some tactical combination here that you cannot take the pawn on b4, because after a takes b4, both black bishops are under attack, and black are gonna lose one of them. Therefore, after b4, the bishop retreats to d6, and white captures the pawn on d5. They have an extra pawn, rook d8, kind of x-raying all white pieces on the d file, b5, blocking any possible initiative black could have on the queen side of the board. Niemann retreats the bishop to b7, exchange of the bishops on b7, and here comes knight c6, using again this beautiful dark square bishop on b2. And now you cannot take the knight with the knight on c6, because after b takes c6, the queen is under attack and the knight is under attack. And if black takes the pawn on c6, after bishop takes f6, black are not on time to play bishop f4, attacking the queen, because the rook would simply be captured. Therefore, in this position, Niemann goes rook d7, knight d5, exchange of the knights on d5. Black bishop retreats to b8, and Dubov's queen is under attack, so it goes to e4. And here, knight takes on c6 for Niemann. What happened in this position? White is considerably better. They have a very active knight on c6. They have a beautiful dark square bishop. So white's position is winning, but not immediately. And what happened was that Niemann touched the knight on e5, and according to chess rules, if you touch a piece, you must make a move with that piece. And if we can see here, the knight on e5 doesn't really have any moves. He would be captured on g4, on f3, on c4, and if it goes on d, which seems like a good move because it attacks the rook, it attacks the bishop, and the knight is protected. After rook d1, it turns out that, again, the knight doesn't have any good moves. If it takes the bishop on b2, rook takes d7, queen takes d7, knight e7 check, and the rook would be lost on the square c8. And if, let's say, knight goes to c5, then Dubov would play queen h4, and white has a devastating attack using weaknesses on the dark squares around the black king. So in this position, Niemann touched the knight, and he made a move with that knight, and he captured the knight on c6, and after b takes c6, it's a fork. You cannot take with the rook because queen e8 checkmate, and again, the checkmate is caused by the dark square bishop on b2. And if queen takes c8, then rook c1, pinning the queen to the rook. And let's say if queen takes e4, rook takes c8, basically a checkmate, again, because the king is cut off. You can still make a couple of moves, but it doesn't change the situation. So Dubov won the game, and then everything was decided in the last game of the match, game number 18. The score was tied, and in game 18 we have this position on the board. Dubov is playing white, Niemann is playing black. The material on the board is 4 pawns against 4 pawns, knight and bishop against 2 knights. And the game should have ended in a draw, but again, it's a blitz game. Both players are under tremendous time control, time pressure. Mistakes can happen. Black knight is under attack, and Niemann moves it to a square c1, attacking the pawn on a2. Dubov defends the pawn with the knight b4. Niemann jumps the knight to e4. Knight goes to c2 for Dubov, attacking the pawn on a3. Knight d2. The bishop is under attack, bishop c4. And here, Niemann makes a move that nobody expected him to make, knight b1. And you have to give credit to Niemann. He is a fighter. He really wants to win in every possible position. So instead of making an easy draw after taking the bishop on c4, he decides to play for a win. His idea was that after knight b1, he protects the pawn on a3. He will take with the next move the pawn on a2, and possibly the pawn on a3 becomes a passing pawn and will be a queen soon. But he probably missed Dubov's next move, and that was b4. Not only Dubov defends the pawn on a2 with the bishop now, but the pawn on b4 becomes a very, very dangerous passing pawn. Knight d2, knight takes a3, exchange of the pieces on c4, knight takes a2, and Dubov starts marching with the passing pawn b5, king e7. You need your king closer to the middle of the board in the endgame, so everything is logical there. The pawn march continues with b6, but Niemann is just on time with the knight to prevent the promotion. Knight b4, b7, knight c6. So the promotion square of b8 is currently protected. h4, very instructional move, because one pawn now takes care of both black pawns, g6 and h5. King continues to go to the middle of the board, king e6. Dubov also activates his king with king g2, king d5, attacking the knight, and the knight jumps to a5. Now you cannot take the knight on a5 because b8 is the queen. Instead, Niemann goes back with knight b8, king f3, king c5, king e4, f6, not allowing any penetration squares to the white king. Check, king c6, king d4 check, and king takes b7. So now black, Niemann, has an extra pawn, but both of his pieces are very far away from the action. He has to defend all these pawns, and his pieces are too far away. There's still a draw, though, because after king d5, there is a move g5. And in this particular position, the culmination of the whole match happened. Both players had seconds on the clock. Dubov plays an absolutely brilliant move, g4. Why this move is brilliant is not because it wins the game, but it makes Niemann think. And he has seconds, and he has to calculate too many variations. Which pawn to take? On h4 or on g4? And the problem is for black that only one of those moves is a draw, and the other one is a mistake, losing the game. And unfortunately for Hans Niemann, he chose to take the wrong pawn. He captured g4, and that's a losing move. Because after h5, this passing pawn is just too strong. Niemann is still on time with the knight, knight d7, but king d6, king e6, attacking the knight. Knight e5, king takes f6, knight f3. You cannot take the knight on f3 in this position because after g takes f, black pawn actually will promote to a queen faster, and black will win. But after knight f3, Dubov just plays a simple move, knight e2, and in this position, Niemann lost the game on time. He didn't manage to make the next move, but again, it didn't really matter. Black cannot stop the pawn h from promotion. So in this endgame, Dubov actually won the match, knight and a half to 8.5. And now Hans Niemann, as the match, will be subject to a lie detector test, as was determined before this match started. And we'll find out what question Dubov would actually ask him, and what will Niemann answer, and whether it would be lie or truth.